Hey, awesome disease and public health students. I'm going to use these slides to go over and review what are called the hygiene and the old friends hypotheses. These are actually slides from a research project that I did as part of a graduate immunology course I took. So you'll see references to some scientific papers at the base of some of the slides, and if you're curious about any of this stuff, I encourage you to try looking those up, or I can try to provide some of the papers to you if you want. So, eating worms to treat autoimmune disease, something we think of as pretty disgusting when you see things like this, but turns out these are actually very important and might actually hold some evolutionary answers to our immune system and how it works and the rise of autoimmune diseases. So, this all relates back to this graph that you saw in the homework, right? And we've discussed this already, but infectious diseases are decreasing rapidly, largely due to our use of vaccines, medications, as well as just increased hygiene, right? And they're not spreading as much. But at the same point, autoimmune diseases, particularly things like asthma and type 1 diabetes, are on the rise. And so these two hypotheses, the hygiene hypothesis and the old friends hypothesis, are two proposals for why this is happening. So what caught my interest about this was actually a paper I read by these two researchers, Parrish and O'Neill. They were studying people who have very heavy parasite loads. I'm going to change the color of my marker here so you can see it a little more clearly. Let's make it bright green. So they conclude that immune response is actually regulated, right? So what they were curious about was if a person has a heavy parasite load, are they more likely to suffer from autoimmune diseases because their immune system is essentially in overdrive, right? They're dealing with parasites. So in fighting the parasite, is their immune system also destroying and attacking other parts of the body? And it turns out that's what they were sort of expecting to find. It's the exact opposite. There's actually a lot of regulation in your immune response, especially in response to certain parasites. It doesn't lead to an overactive immune response. And in fact, people who are exposed to pretty high pathogen loads, especially parasites, experience less autoimmune diseases. They didn't have allergies or asthma or any of these other things that we associate with being autoimmune. So when I first read these papers and began thinking about this, I thought, okay, well then it must be that our immune system is sort of like a well-trained army and it's meant to be fighting things, right? Our whole evolution has been based on that. And so if we're living this very hygienic lifestyle now, we sort of have these bored soldiers, right? These T cells and B cells in our bodies that just begin to attack other stuff. And that's what gives rise to autoimmune diseases. Another cool thing that I read about, which is somewhat related, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Otzi the Iceman, but it's basically a mummy that was discovered in the Alps. It was a person, I think a farmer, a shepherd, believed to have lived around 3,400 to 3,100 BCE. And what's exciting about this is it was just really well preserved in the ice, and so scientists have been studying a lot about specifically the gut microflora. They've been able to take samples from his stomach and intestines, and turns out that he was riddled with these little microbes, gut microbes and bacteria that were pretty bad, but also kind of gave scientists a lot of interesting evidence as to like where he was living before, the things that he ate, and what health issues he might have been suffering from. There's, just on a side note, if you're curious about this, I recommend looking it up. It's fascinating. It turns out he was murdered. He had an arrowhead somewhere inside of him. He was also covered in tattoos, which they think related to his ailments. Like there were places where he was feeling pain, and so he had tattoos in these weird spots. It's pretty interesting to read about. But anyway, the whole point of that is just to emphasize that the human body evolves in response to the environment we're in, and the immune system does the same thing, right? Our immune system is adapted to respond as best it can to whatever pathogens we encounter locally and whatever pathogens we picked up in our lifetime. And you can study the remains of certain humans and learn a lot about where they were and where they lived and what they ate based entirely on the microbes that are present and what their immune system allowed to survive in them and what didn't. So the origin of what's called the hygiene hypothesis. This is the first thing I'm going to look at. It was Strachan in 1989. He was studying British children born in March 1958, and he was looking specifically at rates of hay fever, which was a common thing amongst children. And he noticed that older children in large families with many older siblings usually hay fever occurred less in the younger siblings, right? And the idea was that early and repeated exposure to hay fever from older siblings to these younger siblings conferred additional protection to the younger children, right? They were less likely to suffer from it later in life because their immune system was essentially prepared for it, right? They've been exposed to it early in life. they developed the memory B cells, memory T cells, and so later responses were a lot stronger for their immune system, right? They're essentially being vaccinated for this hay fever disease by being exposed to it from their older siblings. And what they found now in 1989 was increased rates of hay fever, and what they surmised was that it's because it's a lack of early exposure due to increased cleanliness and smaller families, right? So suddenly the older siblings weren't getting hay fever as much, they weren't exposing their younger siblings to it, and so these younger siblings were just much more vulnerable to contracting hay fever and having it in a much worse form. And so it just shows that even though there were some differential illness reporting, especially in rural parts of the world where people don't necessarily go to hospital or seek doctor's advice for treating hay fever, they still found that there was a significant enough difference, right, to compensate for that. So there was definitely a drastic increase in hay fever occurrences now that families tend to be smaller and practicing more hygienic practices. So, in short, right, we can think of organisms that live in our intestines are important to toning and shaping not only our local intestinal immune system, but our entire systemic immune responses. Progressively hygienic lifestyle, people living in industrialized societies, right, this is what we call developed nations, right, have removed us from natural surroundings that drove adaptation of our immune systems and now provide an intestinal environment far different from our ancestors, right? So what our immune system evolved to deal with is very different from what it is now encountering, because we're getting vaccines, we're living in much more hygienic environments, and we're seeing bacteria that are very resistant now and much more pathogenic. Like they're going to make you a lot sicker than they normally would. So this difference is the leading emergence in the various autoimmune diseases. Again, it's sort of that idea that our immune system just isn't as busy as it used to be, and so it's starting to attack self-antigens in the body. So that's the key part for the hygiene hypothesis. The other proposal is called the old friends hypothesis, and I first heard about this reading a much older paper from 1968 by Greenwood. They were studying rheumatoid arthritis, and it was kind of interesting. They're comparing two very different countries, right? They were looking at Nigerian hospitals and hospitals in England and Wales, and they were just looking at reported cases of rheumatoid arthritis. And basically, what they were looking at was they had the expected amounts that they expected to see based on rates they were seeing in England. But it turns out that in a Nigerian hospital, the numbers were way, way lower. Right? You can see here within males of certain age groups, that's what they expected to see, and that's what they actually saw in Nigeria. And again, they kind of tried to, I'm not entirely sure how they controlled for this, but they controlled for the case rate. Like it wasn't that people in Nigeria are less likely to go to a hospital due to arthritis. I mean, that might be true, but I think this study was thorough enough, or they repeated it enough times that they kind of eliminated that as a potential factor. So again, why were rates of rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease, right? It's when your cartilage starts to break down, your immune system attacks it. Why were they a lot lower in what would be considered a quote-unquote underdeveloped nation like Nigeria versus a developed nation? And again, that's not the best classification. I don't like using that terminology, but that's what all these studies are sort of based on. And so what they surmised was that it had to do with helminth infections. Helminths are parasitic worms. They're very common in a lot of parts of Africa, including Nigeria, much less common in England, where just hygienic practices have eliminated them. And it turns out that these helminth infectious worms, they adopt host antigens to hide themselves, right? And so they decrease the immune system sensitivity to self-antigens. In other words, by they're hiding themselves, they're making sure that the host immune system doesn't attack self-antigens because they're using those to hide themselves. But that's also going to decrease rates of autoimmune disorders, right? And so they found that Africans who migrated to England also showed increased autoimmunity. So there's something about maybe losing these helminth infections, losing these parasites, increased rates of having autoimmune disorders. So this really drove the question, how do parasites prevent autoimmune diseases, specifically these helminths? There's also some other little hints, and again, I think this is really fascinating. You can get into what's called scatology, which is the study of poops, specifically human poops. They've apparently discovered in Denmark a lot of these ancient Viking latrines So Vikings were essentially pooping in these giant barrels. They got buried and forgotten, and now they're discovering them. They're full of all these ancient fossilized poops, and you'd think that's gross, but it's actually been a huge treasure trove for scientists because they can study these to look at what was being eaten, what kind of diseases, what kind of parasites were present, and it turns out, I like this little highlighted passage here, so archaeological excavations in Viking latrine pits in Denmark have revealed that these populations suffered massive worm infestations. So they were loaded up with parasitic worms. And again, this is something they think is true going even further back than the Vikings, right? That we have been living with parasitic worms for a large part of human evolutionary history. And so this is the basis of what's called the old friends hypothesis, right? What they mean by old friends is these parasitic worms. It's proposed by Graham A. Rook in around 2003, 2004. This is relatively young theory. So helminths and other microbes have infected mammalian hosts for millions of years. Again, so our evolution has taken place with these parasitic worms in mind, right? And they have basically co-evolved to act as immunoregulators because that's what these parasitic worms do. When they were infected with them, they regulate our immune system to ensure the parasite can survive inside the body. And so helminths in particular are very known to be effective at modulating T cells, specifically what are called T regulator cells. They activate what are called T regulator cells, which are going to modulate and control immune responses. So let's talk about helminths. They're very, very successful parasites, the most successful infectious agents on the planet. About 1.5 billion people are infected with some kind of parasitic worm. A lot of them don't even know about it. You can have heavy infections, right? This is not good, right? Can lead to morbidity. That means death or illness, illness and immortality, which is death. But lighter infections, which are more common, that's something that's okay, right? They lead to limited to no pathology, meaning that you don't show any symptoms, being asymptomatic. And some species can live in human intestines up to 18 years and can continue to breed there. What's also cool about a lot of these parasitic worms is usually once you're infected with one type of parasitic worm, that parasitic worm then protects you from other parasites, right? That parasitic worm is essentially saying, I'm living in here, this is my host body, and they don't allow other parasites and especially other worms to infect you. So adding to your protection a little bit there. So helminths come in a variety of different phyla. You've probably heard of a lot of these, right? There's roundworms, flatworms, tapeworms, flukes. Roundworms are what cause the elephantiasis we were talking about, where they can clog up your lymph. That would not be a good condition to have. Tapeworms, a lot of you have heard about, they get into your intestines and basically start eating the food, leads to things like weight loss. Some people actually intentionally infect themselves with tapeworms to encourage weight loss. To jockeys in particular, horse riders used to do that. Helminth infections, they grow from eggs to larva to immature to mature, so they have this kind of very set life cycle, and it happens in different parts of the body, so they kind of have to migrate around to achieve each stage, and they're all a little different. Nematodes and cestodes, they tend to inhabit the gut. That gut's kind of one of the main sites for these worm infections. Eggs are released often, usually, so they migrate through the gut into your feces. And so again, if in unsanitary conditions where people are pooping on the ground or pooping in soil, the larva can hatch, move up through the soil to the surface. They can penetrate unbroken skin, so if you're walking around barefoot, you'll pick up some of these eggs or worms in the very larval stage. They'll move back into your body and mature in other spots. There are some that, I think this is gross, but they apparently mature in the lungs. They make you kind of cough up some phlegm, which you don't really think much about. You swallow the phlegm as you cough it up, so they've moved essentially from your lungs into your digestive tract and can continue to mature from there, which sounds wonderful, but it's pretty amazing. Think about the worms surviving that. So again, here's just some images. Again, here's a schistosomiasis. Some of you might have heard about it. It's a brain parasite, very famously. There's a bunch of bad worms that infect us. And again, another reason why, especially if you're in tropical areas, you should never, ever walk around barefoot because these worms are literally in the soil ready to move in, even through the tough skin that might be in your heel or something like that. So for my research project, I read a whole lot of papers focusing on the role of helminth worms in preventing autoimmune diseases and triggering immunoregulation. And so these were kind of the focus of what I was reading, but I concluded or was focusing on immunoregulation signals used by helminths and how helminth allergy inhibition mechanisms worked. And I'm not going to go into any of the huge details. Instead, I'll just kind of come to the conclusions that I made. Helminth activation of what are called T regulator cells and production of anti-inflammatory signals protect the helminth, right? So these are basically the worm trying to kind of shut down your immune system so that it can continue to live inside of you without showing any bad things, right? Not causing inflammation, not causing fever. But it also benefits you as a host because it's going to reduce any types of allergies or autoimmune diseases that you might later develop, because it's basically regulating your immune system. This has actually now been used for treatment. So treatment of autoimmune diseases, usually you can intentionally infect yourself with low doses of live helminths, and they take advantage of that immunoregulation process. And so again, this is just showing this is something that our immune system has evolved to respond to. They found that helminth treatment given early in life, often to, again, children, then helps shape the immune system to be a little more regulated, a little more modulated, right? Children who are often infected with helminths, whether intentionally or accidentally, were much less likely to develop allergies or autoimmune diseases later in life because their immune system has essentially been calmed down a little bit, right? Helminths may shield themselves, so the worms may shield themselves using molecular mimicry. So we talked about this earlier. They basically cover themselves in your own self-antigens, and at the same point then help the immune system to not respond to those self-antigens in a negative way, again, preventing autoimmune diseases. They reduce allergen hypersensitivity, which I was explaining earlier, less prone to develop allergies. And again, it's all about activating these T regulation cells. Now, there's a lot more detail that I could go into here, but I'm not going to try to throw all of that at you. So in terms of what I learned from this whole research study, the first thing was that I had misunderstood this, right? That autoimmune diseases aren't due to this bored soldier cell idea, right? It's not like you have an army in your body that it doesn't have anything to do, so it starts attacking other stuff. It's more an imbalance and mismanagement of what these soldier cells do, right? And again, it's just a miscommunication with the signaling, as we've talked about, right? That your immune system checks your immune cells to make sure that they don't respond to self-antigens, but it's possible that there are certain viruses or pathogens that sometimes have an antigen on them that looks similar to an antigen in another part of your body. Again, I think of type 1 diabetes as the classic example, where they think that type 1 diabetes is actually triggered by an infection of some kind of virus that your immune system kills really quickly, but your beta cells in your pancreas are sort of innocent bystanders because they have name tags that look similar to the name tag that was on the virus. And so the immune system destroys those cells as well and destroys your ability to make insulin, and then you have type 1 diabetes. Now, as fancy as genetic sequencing and molecular studies have gotten, there are a lot of underlying mechanisms in the immune system that we still don't understand. And so these hypotheses are called hypotheses because there's still a lot of stuff that needs to be studied and figured out. One thing is for sure, though, and this I think is one of the biggest takeaways I took from this course that I took in graduate school, was that societal and technological changes in our environment, especially nowadays in post-industrial revolution, are happening at a much faster rate than our immune system can adjust to. This is kind of one of the key problems that we as human beings are facing, is that our diets are changing, our behaviors are changing way faster now than evolution can ever compensate for, though we are starting to see some changes. So helminth infections may have many beneficial results as well. They're still parasitic organisms. They can still cause death, and they're capable of being very lethal. And so it's not something that we should just all go out and infect ourselves with helminths. There's got to be some regulation and study behind that. And again, every individual is going to be different in terms of how your immune system handles that. So, all right, so we'll have a little discussion and vote about that, and I guess I'll stop here with